The loss of my mom was my fourth depressive episode, and I remember that summer remembering very little of what actually happened that summer. Um, for those of you who are curious, I did share in previous videos about other major depressive episodes I had in my life. Two of those were before I was officially diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and my fourth one happened in the summer of 2006. So my mom had a stroke in early June, and she was starting to get better. Things were looking up, and my brother and I went from Calgary to Winnipeg to visit her where she was. She was staying in the hospital at the time, and like I said, she was starting to get better. So my brother and I went back to Calgary, and at the time I was working in the financial industry, and I was actually benefit of it is that I was essentially a broker, and I was in charge of my own schedule. So basically, she had a second stroke in early July, and I made the decision to go back to Winnipeg. So at that time, I was living in my mom's apartment, I was driving her vehicle, and I was going to visit her twice a day. And I remember so little about that month. I remember I would go in the morning to see her. She was at Health Sciences, which is a major hospital in Winnipeg, the biggest one. And every time I went there, it felt like my heart was breaking even more. And then in the afternoon, I would go back and I'd meet with a good friend of hers for coffee, and then we'd go visit my mom together. And once in a while, I'd go back in the evening if she was having tests or what have you. And that was an extremely difficult time. After her second stroke, she was essentially nonverbal. She was slightly responsive, like she was hooked up to all these machines, and I noticed when I touched her arm that her pulse would go down. So that was a response, but she couldn't talk, and she barely reacted at all. So I remember I was there about 2 or 3 weeks in Winnipeg, and as I said, every time I went to the hospital, it just really felt like my heart was breaking, and she was not getting any better. There was one period of time where I had a glimmer of hope that things would improve. They did a certain test, which was essentially a spinal tap, and unfortunately that didn't change her situation. So at that point, it was really difficult for me to decide whether to stay or go. I wasn't sure how long she was going to stay that way. I wasn't sure if she'd ever get any better. So, and I had already made plans and paid to go to a conference down in Florida for the industry that I was in. So before going down to the conference, I did say my final goodbyes to my mom, and I'm truly grateful to have had that experience. So I told her everything that I wanted to say to her. And I did actually see a slight tear go down her eye, so she definitely heard what I had to say, which I'm truly grateful for. And when I left Winnipeg to fly down to Florida, I really had mixed feelings. Part of me felt guilty that I wasn't staying with my mom, and then part of me was actually happy to have a break. Because those of you who have experienced a major illness with a family member or friend, you know how draining that is. And I remember during that time in Winnipeg, basically just going to the hospital, and that was about it. I seem to recall seeing a few friends from high school and university, because I'd moved to Calgary, but don't really remember much what I did. I just remember I was kind of in a haze that whole month of July. So I went down to Florida, was at the conference, and then one of my uncles gave me a call and said that my mom had passed away. So I did leave the conference early and went back to Winnipeg, and then we got everything taken care of, in terms of the funeral, etc. And I do admit, for probably about 2 months after that, I was definitely in a serious depression. I was really finding it difficult to have any joy in my life, and just basic things of daily living like showering and eating and cleaning up after myself were extremely difficult. So for those of you who have never experienced a deep depression, that might sound very strange, but that's pretty common. So that depressive episode, I guess part of it that compounded it for me is that we were dealing with my mom's estate, and my brother and I were co-executors. And at the time, I'm ashamed to admit that I was a pretty controlling type A person, believe it or not, for those of you who know me. And my brother just said, "Hey, well, you do it. You're going to do it anyways." And in my mind, I thought, okay, well, I'm in the financial industry anyways. I'm always dealing with numbers. So essentially, I was handling her estate, and it was not a complicated estate by any means. But bottom line is, almost on a near daily basis, I was doing something related to her estate, to calling someone, to getting something completed, to getting some forms signed, some things closed, etc. So I was constantly being reminded of her death for about 3 or 4 months after she passed away. And I'm really grateful that I can look back now and know that I made it through that time, because that was definitely one of the most challenging times of my life in terms of depression. I was just at an extremely low point for a number of months, and I'm really grateful that I made it through there. So for any of you that are watching and thinking of anyone that's going through a difficult time, consider forwarding this video to them. There's a lot of people out there that suffer silently with depression, either diagnosed or undiagnosed, and it's something that we can talk about more. Part of Mental Health Week this week is getting more conversations about mental health going, and getting more people sharing about their experiences. So that's what I'm doing in these videos this week. And I trust that you're getting some value out of what I've said, and I really appreciate those of you tuning in live and also watching later. So take care and enjoy the rest of your day.